for GSM by first removing our two pentalobe screws, one on either side of the dock port assembly on the bottom of the phone. With our pentalobe screws removed, we can take a grip of the rear portion of our phone and slide it upwards about 1/8 of an inch. This should free the back cover from the iPhone for removal. With the cover removed, right away you'll recognize the battery. Let's use our Phillips screwdriver to remove the single screw that's securing its connector into the motherboard. The connector for your battery should now be freed. We can use our spudger to gently pry that up. Make sure to keep track of the small metal clip that's below our battery connector for our reassemble. A combination of our spudger and the use of the plastic pull tab for the battery, and it should lift quite easily for removal. With the battery removed from our iPhone, we can now bring our attention to removing the earpiece speaker. Let's first start by removing the two Phillips screws that are securing the dock port connection into our motherboard. Remove the small cover on that connection. And use our spudger to pry up that connection and peel our ribbon wire back. We've got 6 Phillips screws around the top of the motherboard that need to be removed. With those screws removed, we have a metal plate that's covering the majority of our connections for our motherboard. Let's lift this plate from the iPhone. We can now begin peeling back some of our connections, starting with our rear-facing camera, and we can lift that up and out of the phone. Five additional connections that need to be removed, starting with our touchscreen, our LCD connection, our power and volume button connection, our front-facing camera connector, and our headphone jack assembly connection. We want to remove the standoff that's right under all of these connections. Use a small flathead screwdriver for removal. We have a Phillips screw that's securing the bottom of our motherboard down by the speaker assembly. Pull up the small coaxial connection for our antenna. And let's use a SIM card removal tool or a paper clip to remove the SIM card tray out of the side of the phone. This should loosen and free up our motherboard so we can lift it out of the iPhone. With our motherboard removed, that will reveal the top of our earpiece speaker that's only secured with a small amount of adhesive. We can use a pair of tweezers or a spudger to pry this piece up for removal. We can now pull the front-facing camera out of its housing. The phone's vibrator motor is secured by 2 Phillips screws on either side of it. Let's remove those screws and peel the vibrator out of the phone. This next part, where we're working on the headphone jack assembly, we need to be extra careful. The ribbon wire is incredibly delicate when we're peeling it out of the adhesive, securing it into the phone. Once we have the ribbon wire peeled out of the way, we can gently pry up on the headphone jack itself. Do not try to remove the headphone jack assembly at this point, as it's still connected to the volume buttons in the side of the phone. We've got 4 Phillips screws securing these buttons into the side of the phone. We can go ahead and remove them. With our securing screws removed and our ribbon cable out of the adhesive, we can now remove this entire assembly. Let's get in there and remove our loudspeaker. We have 2 Phillips screws on either side. Removing those screws, and now we can gently pull the speaker out of the body of the phone. Bringing our attention over to the display now. We have our securing screws, one on each corner of the display assembly. As well as 3 in either side of the phone. Keep in mind on our side securing screws that we're not totally removing them. We're only backing them out about halfway. With all of our screws addressed, we now attack the display assembly at one of the corners, trying to create a separation from the frame of the phone. And with that separation created, we can now bring in our plastic opening tool to finish off the separation around the entire perimeter. And we can now remove the display assembly from the phone for replacement. Let's go ahead and start on the reassemble of our iPhone 4 GSM, starting with our home button. Let's fish the ribbon cable through the back side of the phone and line it up with our locking socket, which is located right behind the dock port assembly. With our home button securely in place, we can bring in our new display. When lining up our display, let's worry about 2 things. Obviously, the tabs that are going to go ahead and secure it to the body of the phone. But when we're looking at the 2 ribbon cables that we're fishing through, when we do set the display in place, be sure that these ribbon cables are at equal length. If they're not at equal length, we need to reset the display to make sure that we didn't pinch those ribbon cables upon setting it onto the frame. At this point, we can now begin working with our securing screws, starting with the 3 in either side of the body. And we can bring in our 4 Phillips screws, one for each corner of the display. Let's now reinstall our headphone jack assembly. That also comes along with our volume control buttons for the side of the phone. Let's line up our volume buttons and set them in place. Secure those down with their 4 securing screws. And then we can set the headphone jack itself into its housing. Go ahead and set in your front-facing camera. And here's our motherboard set back down into the phone. To secure the motherboard while we work on some of the other components, we do install one of the Phillips screws here. And we can now bring in our rear-facing camera and set it into its housing and buckle down its connection to the motherboard. Go ahead and secure our connections for our touchscreen and LCD. How about our connection here for the headphone jack assembly? Our connection here for our volume and power buttons. And then, of course, our connection for our front-facing camera. Let's not forget about the vibrator motor in the upper corner of the phone. We've got our 2 Phillips screws that are going to secure that in tightly. Screw down the standoff in the upper corner of the motherboard that's closest to the headphone jack. Don't forget to use your flathead screwdriver on that one. Let's now reset in our protection plate for all of our ribbon cable connections. And install all the Phillips screws to secure it in place accordingly.